Hey everyone, welcome back to the Code Wolf, and today we've got a special full-length tutorial for you. We're going to be building an app from start to finish, every step along the way, no shortcuts and no gaps. We're going to be building a language flashcard app that uses the Azure AI Translation service to translate whatever language or word we need on demand. So if we look at our app in the browser, I have this running on a simulated iPad Air since this is kind of mobile oriented, but we just have a simple UI here where we can pick a language. So I've chosen German. And when we hit next, it gives us a new word that the user tries to guess. And then they can hit this translate button to see if they were correct or not, or if they guessed it right. And then they hit next and there's a new word and you can keep going. So you'll notice there's actually a large number of words and they're chosen randomly and it will translate to whatever the language they've selected. So if we switch to Spanish and then we hit next, we'll get the translation there as well. After we build this, you'll also understand how to add your own additional languages and your own custom dictionaries and your own additional words to the library. We're going to walk through the whole thing and even deploy it out to Azure. So this will be great. I'm excited. Let's dive in and get started. Please remember to hit subscribe or like the video to support the channel. This content is a lot of work and it really helps. All right, so just two really quick slides here just to make sure we start off on the same page here. To complete the tutorial ahead, you'll either need Visual Studio or some other editor of your choice. I'll be using Visual Studio just because it has some nice UI options for working with the .NET templates and some other tasks, but feel free to use whatever you're comfortable with. There's a download link if you want to follow along exactly. You will also need .NET 6 or higher to match the general project structure, though .NET 8 really is preferred. This is a major release that came out a little while ago here, and that'll just ensure there's no inconsistencies. You'll also need an Azure subscription. Actually has a free tier, so that's nice. You should be able to complete this without having to pay for anything. So go ahead and get signed up with a free trial if you haven't already. I also recommend you have at least very basic working knowledge of .NET and Azure. Although this is a beginner level course, it's more beginner in the sense of connecting all these pieces and getting more comfortable with them, and not a complete from the ground up introduction to these tools. So if you've worked with these technologies at all in the past, you'll probably be fine, and hopefully you'll learn a lot more about how to connect them all together. Now, a quick word about architecture. So we're going to be building the UI for our app in Blazor WebAssembly, just pure client-side WebAssembly, nothing on the server side in terms of Blazor, so that should be pretty straightforward. And our UI is going to communicate with a small minimal API that has a couple of endpoints to manage some of our data and talk to our Azure Translate service, which is the last piece of this, that Azure AI Translation service. Now, the reason we need this minimal API in the middle is to hold on to some of those secure keys for talking to our Azure service and loading in our dictionary data of words, and just sort of acting as a middleman for our data and security concerns in between the UI and the cloud. This is actually a pretty standard architecture out there, and we're going to take things one step at a time to keep this approachable. So with all that said, let's jump right in and start coding. All right, so let's start out by creating the project that we'll be working with. So inside Visual Studio, let's go up to File, New Project, and then in our template selection here, let's search for Blazor. And in this case, I'm going to go with a Blazor WebAssembly standalone app. This will keep things simple. With this approach, all of our code will be running client-side. It'll just be out there in the browser, and we don't have to worry about any of the other rendering modes or anything like that. So this will be a simple solution, and it'll talk to our API that we'll build in a moment. So let's hit next, and I'm going to call this Flashcards UI, just so we know which project we're dealing with, and click next. Then make sure you have the latest version of .NET selected here. I'm going to be using version 8, so I'd recommend going with that. And we're not going to worry about authentication at the moment, so we can leave the rest of these settings as is and click Create. So once Visual Studio creates that, we'll have our project over in the Solution Explorer on the right here. And you can see we've got a few components out of the box. These are page components, so we can reach them through URLs in the browser. And of course, we have our main layout and all of the usual Blazor staples. This program.cs file, this is sort of the main configuration or setup file that actually runs our app and puts together some of our services and things like that. We'll look at that a bit later. But for now, let's actually run the app to see what this looks like out of the box and what we'll be building off of. So once this loads, we can see our WebAssembly app. This is all running right in the browser using Blazor and WebAssembly. There's nothing happening on the server aside from the initial load here to bring all of our assets down. And so we can navigate between our pages, and we have some nice functionality here. But to build our flashcard app, we really only need one page in our app. We don't really care about weather data or a counter or anything like that. So let's switch back to Visual Studio and just set this up to get started how we want it. So the first thing we can do is just delete the weather and counter components. So I'll get rid of those. And so we just have our home component here. And we can update the page title to something like flashcards or whatever you'd like. And maybe set the H1 to also match that. We'll refine this markup in a little bit, but this will put us in a good spot. And this home page has the app page directive, which just tells Blazor that this is a file or component that is routable. And so then we define the route right after that. In this case, we're only using a slash because that defines this as our home page. We're not using, a URL path like /counter or anything like that. This is just going to be our home page. Now, we also want to update our main layout and navigation to match that sort of single page structure that we're looking for. We don't really need to navigate between different pages on our site for our flashcards. So inside of the main layout, you can see we have the basic structure of our site here. We have a sidebar on the left with our nav menu, and then we have the main body content. So this app body directive, this is where those routed components are injected when they're rendered. So if you do have your counter component or a weather component, when you navigate to those pages, that content is rendered and injected in the body, and then the rest of this content stays the same between pages. And that's why our left nav is outside of the body content, and so that's always there on the left. However, we don't need this sidebar for our purposes, so I'm going to delete that out of here. And then optionally, you can just delete the component itself. So if we open this up, this just has those 3 links to our home, counter, and weather that we looked at. So I'm going to get rid of that and just delete that. And this will really simplify our project. And now we'll be in a good place to get started. So next we're going to take a look at writing the markup for our UI. All right, so next let's build out the markup and HTML for our UI, and that way we'll have something to see and work with in the browser. And then in the next section, we'll empower that using Blazor components and attributes and so on to add that interactivity. So to start with, let's just create a wrapper div here, just a standard HTML div. And I'm going to use a few Bootstrap utilities here for formatting and to use the layout structure, but you really don't have to know Bootstrap to follow along with this video. It's just a few classes to remember here. So inside of this row, let's add another div, and this is going to have a class called call_large-4. And in Bootstrap, what this means is it'll use the Bootstrap column system, so there's 12 columns by default. And this is going to say on large screens, limit this to taking up 4 columns, so it'll be about 1/3 of the page. And that way it doesn't stretch too big on large displays. And on smaller displays, it'll just fill up the whole screen like on phones or small tablets, so it looks like a nice flashcard app. And that's really all you have to know for Bootstrap for this video. So just go ahead and create these wrappers. And next, let's create a HTML select element. And let's give this a class of form select and some margin. And these are just sort of visual style classes from Bootstrap that add a little bit of nice styling to make this look better. And inside of the select, we want to have 3 options for the user to pick from. And really you can add as many options as you want, but I'm going to add 3. And these are going to be the languages that they can pick. So this will be the language they select, and that will get used by the Azure service to translate the vocab word into that language. So if I were to copy this, we can add a few different languages here. So I'll add one for German, and the language code for that is DE. And let's also add Spanish or whatever you'd like, and the language code for that is ES. So these language codes are used by Azure to know what language to translate into. And if you go out on Google, you can find a whole huge table of every language that Azure supports. But I know these 3 offhand, so we're going to go with these. So the next thing that we want to do, and I'm just going to add a break here. These break tags aren't the best practice in HTML, but for a simple app, it's fine. So let's add displays for our vocab word and the translation of that. So we're going to say vocab word, and for now we can just say hello. This will get replaced later by a dynamic word that's loaded in from a dictionary. And then let's create a header to just kind of create a dividing line. And below that, we'll say translation. And for now, just call that world. So this will get replaced later by the translated word from Azure. And then let's just add another break tag. And finally, we want two buttons at the bottom of this markup. And the first button is going to be the button the user clicks on to translate the word and see the answer. And the other button they'll use to navigate to the next word. So I'll create one button here. And again, these are just optional styling classes here from Bootstrap. So the button class just shapes it into a button, and then button primary is just the primary color. So you can set colors with different classes as well. And we'll just make the text of that button translate. So when they click on it, it'll translate the word. And let's create another button down here. And we'll give this a secondary color since it's the second most important button on the page. And we can call this next. So that's the button they'll click to load the next word from the dictionary. And that essentially completes our markup, believe it or not. So let's just run this and see what this looks like as placeholder HTML. So when the page loads, this might look a little small at first glance. So I'm going to zoom in here to 200%. But this is roughly what the UI will look like. And if we inspect this, we can view it on a mobile device as well. So right now, notice that this is taking up about 1/3 of the width of the screen. Well, if we simulate a mobile device, so if I just pick like an iPhone here, you can see it looks better on mobile, so it takes up the whole screen. And we can switch this to responsive, and notice that it fills up the entire screen up until our Bootstrap 1/3 hits, and then it snaps over to the left to only take up 1/3 of a larger screen. Now, if you want to improve this a little bit further, one thing you can do is add a float end to the next button, and that'll cause this button to pop over to the right once this reloads here. So Blazor actually does support live editing where it'll update as you code, so that's nice. And now our next button isn't crammed up against the translate button. And although I'm zoomed in here, the default font is pretty small. So a quick fix for that is just to go into HTML here in this app.css, and you can just say a font size of 2M, and that'll increase the root size. So notice everything is much bigger now. So even at 100%, it's much bigger. So go ahead and play around with that. I'm just going to leave this like this as a quick solution. I think this looks fine for us to continue on. So in the next section, we'll start to add some Blazor code in here to start to make this interactive. All right, so now let's start to add some Blazor interactivity into this standard HTML markup. And before we do that, let's think about what we actually need from Blazor here. Like, what properties and methods do we need to capture the functionality of our app? And so there's a few obvious candidates here. So for one thing, we need to be able to bind this target language to something so that we can send it over to Azure and tell it what they selected and what it should translate into. Second of all, we need a property to store the current vocab word. Obviously, we don't want to leave this hard-coded to hello, so that needs to be a variable or property of some sort. And the same goes for our translation, because that has to be dynamically updated. So we've got 3 properties here, and then we're also going to want 2 methods. So there's going to be one method that will actually translate the word, so it'll go out to our API or to Azure and go and get the translation and bring it back and put it in the UI. And then we also need one other method for next, and that's going to load a new word from our list of words or our dictionary and refresh the screen for that new word so that they can guess the next flashcard. So let's get to work here and set this up. Now, right now we're using a standard HTML select element, but let's change this to an input select. And this is an out-of-the-box Blazor component for working with select items. And the only thing we have to do besides changing that name there is to add a bind value attribute. And this is going to tell Blazor to bind whatever the user selects to a property on our component called selected language. And right now we don't have that property, of course, so let's create one. And if we open up this code block down here, we can use this to write C# code right in our component. And so the first thing we'll want to do is create a property to hold the language they selected. So let's just make this a public string of selected language with a get and set, and we'll set a default value of en. So when the page loads, this will be set to English, the target will be English. And then when they select a different item, it will bind that value to this property. So it'll update every time they select, which is nice. Now the next thing we'll want to do is to create a C# list to hold all the different words that can be used as flashcards. This will be kind of our dictionary. So if we create a new list here, I'll just call this words and set that to an empty list for now. But this will allow us to randomly pick a word from a list, and we're going to retrieve this list from our API later on. And that way we can dynamically change or expand that list later on. Now there's two other properties we want here, and that's our vocab word and our translation. So I'm just going to add those in quick as well. So we'll say current word for the current flashcard that they're on. And I'm just going to set this to string.empty. And let's create another one for the translated word. So this is the one that will come back from the Azure Translation Service. And let's set that to empty as well. And then we'll be good to go from a property standpoint. So these four properties will hold all of the values that we need to update our UI. Now, remember, we also have these two buttons here. So we need some methods to go along with these. We need our translate method, and we need a next method to load the next word or the next flashcard. So let's start by creating a translate method. Let's create a signature here for a method called translate. And that's going to return a task so it can run async. Whenever you're making API calls, ideally you'd want to make these async so that they don't block the thread that the UI is running on. So here we can set the translated word property we created, and this is going to be the result of what comes back from Azure. Now, at the moment, we're not talking to Azure, we're not talking to our API, so let's just set this to some sort of placeholder. So we'll call this translated hello or something like that. Later on in the video, we're going to wire this up so that this is dynamic, but we just want to test that our basic Blazor interactions are working first. So now that we've created this method, we can add that to our button so that when the user clicks on it, it gets fired. So if we say onClick equals translate, now whenever the user clicks this button, this method will get called. It'll set the translated word to whatever text we have here, and later what will come back from our API. I realize this is cased wrong, so I'm just going to update that quick. And so it'll set our translated word correctly, and that'll update in our UI, and so on. So let's finish this out by creating the next method. So we want an onClick for next as well. So I'll scroll down here a little bit, and we'll call this method next word. So this will pick the next word from our list or from our dictionary and update the UI accordingly. So the first thing we'll want to do is set our translated word back to an empty string so that they don't see the answer when the next word loads, or they don't see the previous results. That'll reset the UI state for that. And the next thing we want to do is randomly choose a word from our list. So remember, this list of words, that's going to store all of the words that come back from our API. Those are all the words that are potential flashcards. And we want to select those randomly so that as they click through the app, they get different words and they can practice, and it's not always the same. So let's start off by creating a random number. So I'll call this an integer with a name of num. And we can just create a new C# random here and call random.next, which is a built-in method that can generate us a random number within a range. And we're going to say that range is between 0 and the words.count. So essentially this will give us a random number in between 0 and the number of items in our words list. And that's important because that means this will be dynamically within range. So for example, if 50 words come back from our API, or if 100 words come back, the random number that we select to show a flashcard from will always be within that range. And that way we can set the current word and then use that random number to select one of the words from our list. And just for starters here, let's put a couple words in this list just so that this is easier to demo. So we can say apple, orange, pear. These words really don't matter right now. We're going to get a bigger list from our API later on, but this will give us enough to start with. Now, the last missing piece here is that when the app first loads, we want to call this next word method to load like an initial word and kind of set the initial state. And Blazor has a method we can call as the component is initializing, and we can actually override a method. So I'll say override task, and that's called onInitialized async. And inside of here, we can simply call next word. So when the app loads, it's going to call this method and set up some initial UI configurations for us. So this is actually all we need to test the app in terms of the UI, and we'll wire up our data in API shortly. So with that in place, let's also make sure we finish updating our static content at the top. So first, on this next button, we of course want to add another onClick event here, and let's trigger our next word method there. So now both of our buttons are tied to their respective methods. And one other thing we forgot to do is to just make sure that these words here are also being dynamically set. So instead of just being hard-coded to hello, we can set this to current word, and then we can also set this to translated word down below. And that way, as the user interacts with our site, our words will update dynamically instead of just being hard-coded. Remember, these are going to reflect whatever is set on these properties in our code, and we're dynamically updating those in this next word method to update to the next flashcard. So let's run the app and see what this gives us and make sure it's all working as expected. All right, so when our page loads, let's test this out. So you can see we initially loaded the word pair, and that's because we randomly chose from our list of 3 words. And now if we click this translate button, you can see it updates with that static text that we entered, the translated hello. And later on, it's actually going to dynamically translate that word, but this at least confirms that our translate button is updating this word with whatever comes out of that method. And then if we hit next, you can see now it's selected a new word from our list, randomly I might add. And so now we have apple, and if we hit translate, we again get this translation. So we're at least now able to kind of click through things, and our UI is working dynamically, but of course it's not translating or lining up the word correctly. And we want to verify that this is working once in this dropdown once we get our translation service working. So next, let's create our API that the UI will talk to in order to get these translated words and our dictionary and all that goodness. Okay, so back in Visual Studio, next let's create the API that our UI will talk to. That API in turn will talk to Azure, and so essentially we can send a request from our UI to our API to get a translation or to get a list of words, and it will supply those values either itself or through Azure, through an additional request. So let's see how this works or how this comes together. So first off, at the top on our solution, let's say add new project, and we want to create an API. So I'll just search for that quick. And so just make sure that you choose ASP.NET Core Web API, and I'll click next. And let's call this Flashcards API, and click next again. And make sure you have .NET 8 selected, of course. And we don't need to worry about authentication right now. I'm actually going to uncheck use controllers. I'm going to be using the minimal API syntax since it's a little bit simpler to work with. But of course, if you prefer the controller method and are somewhat familiar with that, you could also just plug in the logic into your controllers. But I'm going to go with this, so I'll click create, and Visual Studio will finish setting that up for us. So let's open up our program.cs to see what we have here. So like any API in .NET, this is a pretty standard structure. At the top here, it's adding whatever essential services we want to register with our app for dependency injection. So those will be available for us to work with. And then it's going to build out our middleware pipeline. And so these are kind of the building blocks to handle our request. We're not going to get into all that stuff right now. What we're interested in is this part down here where we can start to add endpoints to provide functionality to our app. And right now this is supplying weather data, but that's not what we want. We want to supply a list of words, and we want to talk to Azure to translate the word that the user selected. So I'm just going to delete most of this data out here. We can leave the shell of this get method, but instead of a weather forecast, we're going to say get words, and we'll just call this words. So this will return a list of words to the UI that it can randomly choose from to display to the user. And then we don't need this weather forecast either. So this will give us kind of a nice starting setup for our API that we can start to build our endpoints with. So to create those endpoints, I have this file here that is just a giant list of words, and this is going to act as sort of a dictionary or starting point for our word list. And remember, all of this is available out on GitHub in the link below, so if you want to use this list, feel free. Otherwise, you can just use whatever set of words you want. So to start with, I'm going to copy this list of words, and then in our API, I'm going to add a new file, and this is going to just be called words.txt. So I'll add that in here and paste in all of our words. So this will give us a nice list so that when they're randomized, they're rarely the same because there's so many of them. Now, back in our program.cs file, we want this /words endpoint to read in that file and return all of the results back to the user. And to do that is actually really simple. So we can just say file.readAllText, and then we can pass in our words.txt file that we just created that lives in our root. And then we'll just want to use the split command and tell it to split based on a comma. So if we look in this file, each of these words is separated by a comma. And so if we use this split, it's going to make every word a different item in an array, because you can see this returns an array as its type. So then we can just simply return this from our API endpoint. So it's going to return a huge list of words. Now, in a real app, you might want to make this a little more robust with returning different response types depending on what happens, but we're going to keep this simple for this beginner level tutorial. So now we have an endpoint to return our list of words, and the second endpoint that we need is the one that will actually translate the word that the user is currently working on. So if we just copy this and create another endpoint, I'm going to call this /translate. And in this case, we're going to want this to be async because this is actually going to go out and talk to Azure. But this is going to accept two parameters. So the first one is going to be that target language that they selected. So remember we had that drop down where they could pick German or Spanish or so on. So we want to send that language code along so that this is dynamic, and as they choose different languages, it'll translate accordingly. So we want to pass along that language. And then we need to receive the word itself. So whatever vocab word the user is currently on, we want to send that to this endpoint to have it translated. Then in the body of our method, this is where we're going to go out to Azure and translate things. But for now, until we get our Azure service set up, we can just say return translated plus word, just as a really basic response. This is just going to be used to verify that our API is receiving our word properly and sending back a response that the UI is able to consume. One other thing we have to remember to do is change this name property here. These can't be the same, so this one up here is called words. So we'll call this translate. I also just noticed that I misspelled words here, so this is actually words.txt. But anyway, now we're ready to run this app and test things out. And there's a couple ways we can do that because our UI is still set as the default project over here. And so if we were to just press run at the top, that's going to start our UI project. So what we can do is either right click on this and choose set as startup project for our API project, and then it'll launch using the Visual Studio Run button. Or we can just go down to debug and say start new instance. And that's an easy way to launch the project without having to change the default. And so when that loads, we get this nice Swagger UI interface. I actually really like that .NET kind of sets this up out of the box for us using the default templates. So we have our two endpoints here that we can test out with this nice UI. So if I were to say try it out and choose execute, you can see, sure enough, we get our full list of words down below. So this will return an entire dictionary out to the front end. Now, if we collapse this again and test out our other endpoint, it's going to ask us when we try this out to provide a target language and a word. So I'll just pass in EN for our target language for English, and our word can be hello. And when I execute, sure enough, we get back translated hello. Remember, right now we're just kind of appending that to the end and returning it just to make sure that our API endpoint is working. But once we actually talk to Azure, this will be dynamic. Now, one thing I want to talk about really quickly here is just the overall architecture of this. So for example, right now we're using this /words endpoint to get a huge list of words and send that to the UI. And that's only going to happen once when the app first loads in the UI. So it's not that big of a deal that we're sending a lot of data over. And then we're translating these words one at a time through Azure as the user clicks through the app. But you could, of course, set this up all kinds of different ways. You would really have to analyze what will be most performant or efficient. And what I mean by that is, for example, we could set this up where you could ask for one word at a time as the user navigates, and every time it'll go out to the API and it'll get a different random word just like we're doing on the front end. Or you could translate all your words ahead of time and just have different lists that you return based on what the user selects, things like that. So this isn't necessarily the most performant or most ideal option for this. I'm just trying to give you different examples of how you can communicate between a UI and an API and the Azure service that we're going to set up. And speaking of the Azure service, let's go out and create that now so we can start adding some real dynamic functionality into our app. Okay, so out in the Azure portal, let's create our AI translation service. And there's different ways to do this, but we're going to stick with the portal because that's just sort of a straightforward visual option. So when you go out to Azure, make sure you click on All Services, and then navigate to the AI plus Machine Learning category, and finally the Translators option. Now, right now we don't have any translation services, but we can of course create one. So on this create page, I'm going to leave the subscription here, but just pick whatever one you'd like. Now there is a free tier of this service. So subscriptions deal with billing, but if you're using the free tier, it shouldn't matter too much, but just pick the one that, but just pick the right subscription for you. And then for the resource group, I'm going to create a new one, and we'll call this CodeWolf flashcards or something, so that all of our flashcard resources are in one spot. And for the region, this is actually important because I've noticed that there's not a free tier available in all regions, which is pretty important. One that I know does have a free tier is East US, so I'm going to pick that. But just experiment with regions that are close to you that have a free pricing tier. So when you go down into here, you can see there's this free up to 2 million characters per month, which is actually pretty cool. So I'm going to click that option, but just make sure you pick a region that supports that. And for the name, we'll call this CodeWolf Translator. That'll be the name of our service. So let's review and create. We'll leave the rest of this stuff at the default. And it's going to go through and validate our settings. So I'll give this a second. And after that validates, you can kind of scroll through here and see the summary, but I'm just going to click create, and it's going to initialize that deployment for us. In my experience, this actually gets created fairly quickly, but just give that a second to finish, and then we'll be back. And that didn't take long at all. So next I'm going to click Go to Resource. And sure enough, here is our translation resource. And now we're going to take a look at how to start wiring all this up with our app. All right, so back in our app, let's start to wire this up to use that Azure Translate service that we just created. And the way we're going to do that is using the Azure SDK, which is exposed through some NuGet packages. So first, let's go over to our dependencies in our Solution Explorer and right-click and say Manage NuGet Packages. And this allows us to bring in little containers of functionality that include different C# classes and services to work with Azure. So if we were to browse for Azure.ai.translate or something like that, just kind of start to search here, we want to choose this Azure Text Translation Service. So I'm going to install that. And when you're prompted, just agree to the terms if you agree, and let that install. And there's one other package that we want as well, which is going to be Microsoft.extensions.azure. And this provides all kinds of useful extension methods and other tools to make writing our code a little bit nicer. So I'm going to install this as well and give that a second to finish after we accept the terms. And then let's navigate back over to our program file. Now, the proper way to start working with the SDK is to register the services that it includes for dependency injection with our DI container. And the way we do that is using this builder object. So you can see up here, we're already adding a couple services just out of the box, but we can of course add more. So we can say builder.services.add Azure clients. And if you don't see this pop in with IntelliSense, you can go ahead and add a using statement up here for Microsoft.extensions.azure, and you can see that pops in down here. So now we have this add Azure clients method, and then we can use this method to register some different things here. So this will give us access to a client builder object, so we can use Lambda syntax here, and we'll say client builder.add text translation client. You can see that IntelliSense is suggesting that because we installed that AI package. So I'll hit enter, and this accepts a variety of parameters depending on what you're trying to do. But if we think about this, there's a couple things we need to be able to talk to our Azure service. We of course need an authentication key, or we could also use passwordless authentication using Entra, but I'm going to keep this simple and use the key approach. And then we also need the URI to that service as well as the region. And there's different combinations of these values that you can pass into this, but we're going to keep things simple. So to start with, let's say new Azure key credential. And this allows us to pass in our key. And so if I add a using statement for that as well. And so we'll want to pass in our key to this credential object. Now, you never want to just hard code keys in your code if you can avoid it. You want to keep those secure somewhere. We're going to take kind of a middle approach by at least putting them in configuration files, but they're not going to be super secure. That'll be another topic for a different video. So conventionally, you can always put configuration files in your app settings file up here. So we're going to add a couple settings in here for the URL and the key to that Azure service that we just created. So we'll be able to talk to it. And to access those values, we can say builder.configuration. And let's say we want to access the translate key for our first parameter. And then we also want to create a new URI, and this will tell our code where to go out and find that service. And for that, we can say builder.configuration translate URL. So again, we'll pass in the key and the URL for where to find this service, and that'll satisfy the needs of this SDK. And then finally, there's one more parameter for the region. That one I'm just going to hard code. I won't bother putting that in the configuration file. So now we have these three parameters, but of course these are just key names. We need to put the actual values in our configuration file. So let's go back to our app setting, and then we can say translate key. And for now I'll say hello, and then we'll say translate URL. And next we want to go out to Azure and actually get these values. So obviously we don't want these placeholders here. So back out in Azure, it's really easy to get those values. If we look under keys and endpoint here under resource management, we can of course copy our keys. There's two keys that it provides here and also gives you the location and region. And then our endpoints are down here as well. So first let's copy that key, and we'll go back and put that in as our translation key. Never share these keys. These are highly secure. Obviously, I'll be deleting this right after this, but we'll put that value in there. And then let's go back and get our text translation API. We don't want to use the document one. We want the text translation. So I'll grab that and put that in for our translation URL. And so now when the app actually runs and registers this text translation client that talks to Azure, that's going to pull in the key and URL that we just put in the config file, and it's going to create a translation service for us that we can inject throughout our code and use to talk to Azure. So as an example of that, let's revisit our endpoints further down. Now you'll remember right now we're accepting a target language and a word on our translate endpoint. Well, the last thing we need here is that translation service. So these values aren't meaningful by themselves. We need a service that can actually do something with them. And for that, we can use the text translation client from the Azure SDK. So that NuGet package that we just installed, we can bring in the using statement for that. That package provides us with this client, this translation client. This is the same one that we set up right here. So see where it's saying add text translation client. This is registering it with our apps DI container with the right configurations, and then we can grab that and inject it down into our endpoints below. So now instead of just returning a hard-coded word, we can actually call out to Azure and get the translated value. So let's say that we want to use that client, and with our IntelliSense, we can see there's a few different methods here. I'm going to use translate async. And if you look at these parameters, it's asking for a target language and the text that we want to translate, and obviously optionally a source language and a cancellation token, some other things. All we really care about right now are passing in the target language and the word that we already supplied to our method. So we can see this is all starting to come together now. We're sending over those values to Azure. So now this method, instead of just returning hard-coded response, it can return a translated word. Now at the moment we're still returning our hard-coded text here, so let's change that. And this response object that comes back is a little bit gnarly, so it's several layers of nested objects. I've kind of gone through and figured out exactly what we need from it first. This translation service can do a lot of things, so it returns kind of a complicated data structure. But on that response object that we get back, if we just say response.value, and we'll say first or default dot translations, so it brings back a list of translations, and then again first or default dot text, this will give us the actual translated value of what we sent over. And I realize this is a little bit ugly right here. You definitely want to do something better than this in a real app. You'd either want to check for nulls or map this to a better structure or something. But we just want to get this working, so we're just grabbing the data directly off and assuming that this is going to work properly for our simple scenario. So with all that set, let's actually test this out and make sure that our translation is working properly. Remember, we can do that by right-clicking and going to Debug, Start New Instance, and then we can use that Swagger UI again to test our updated methods. Okay, so back in the browser, we still have our two endpoints. And of course, if we try out our /words, we still get our words back. There's no changes there. But let's see what happens now when we test our translate endpoint. So for our target language, if we remember from our UI, we could use like DE, which is the code for German. And if we say something like automobile, now when we hit execute, our code is actually going to go out to Azure, and you can see it brings back a translated response. So if I were to change this to hello and execute this again, we get German. And if we say world, we get the German word for that back. This is kind of cool. You can just kind of experiment with this right here. But the cool part is that this is all working properly and we're getting our translated words back. So our endpoints here are pretty much set. Obviously, they're a little bare bones. But now let's start to see how we can hook up our UI and really start leveraging this. Okay, so we're almost there, I promise. The last thing we need to do is wire up our UI to talk to our API endpoints that we've created. So to start with, let's head back over to our home component. And if you recall, right now there's still some things that are just kind of hard-coded in here. So our translated word is still hard-coded, and our list of words are hard-coded to just 3 items up here. We want to replace these to use our endpoints on our API to dynamically populate them. And to do that, we need an HTTP client object to talk to our API. Now, if we go over to the program.cs file, the out-of-the-box templates were nice enough to already set some of this up for us. So we have this HTTP client object right here. This is being added to our dependency container, so we can inject that into our components and use it to talk to other APIs. Now, the only issue here is that right now this builder.hostenvironment.address, this is not the correct URL for HTTP client. This is essentially going to point to itself right now when the app runs, and we want it to point to our flashcards API. Now, an easy way to get the URL of our API, aside from just running it and looking at the URL, is if we go over to the launch settings under that API project, we can grab this URL here under the HTTPS option. So just kind of scroll through here and find that, copy this out of here, and then let's go back to the program.cs in our Blazor app, and let's paste that in here. So in a real app, you'd want a more robust way of discovering and tracking these different URLs as your services talk to each other, but this works for a basic app like this. So let's go back into our home component, and now let's start to wire up some of these methods to our endpoints on our API. The first thing we need to do is inject our HTTP client. So I'll add that at the top and call that client here. And this gives us access to an instance of the one that we just configured here. So that client is gonna point to our API. And now we can use this client to take advantage of those endpoints that we worked so hard on. So when our app loads, instead of hard coding those words, let's retrieve those from the API using our client. So we can say get from JSON async, and we're going to be expecting a list of strings, since remember we're essentially just returning a long list of those vocab words. And then we need to pass in the base address here. So that's just going to be /words. Remember, this is already wired up to use the URL and port of our API. We just have to supply the path. We also want to make sure that we await this since it's an async call. So that'll give us our words. And then we call the next word method as usual, and it'll randomly select a word from that list and set that in our UI. So now our list should be all set. Now for this translate method, this one's a little bit trickier, but we still want to use this same client object. But this time we can just say get string async, since it's just going to be a single word. And below here, Let's retrieve a word from the /translate endpoint. And remember, we want to pass along two parameters to that endpoint. Remember, we want our selected language and we want the current word. Those are what we added to our API endpoint. So first, let's say target language equals, and we can pass along the selected language. Remember, this is what the user picked from the dropdown in our UI. And then we can say the word is the current word. So this is the word that's set randomly from our list of words. We want to pass that along and get that translated by Azure. And I'll just fix up some of the spelling here. So that's going to give us our translated word when they click the translate button. Now, as we're reviewing this, there's a couple of cleanup items here. We ended up not needing this to be async, so I'm just going to change this to void. There's not any async or task-based logic going on in here. So we can just call that void. And there's one other thing that we'll want to do. Right now, if this UI were to call out to our API, those requests would actually be rejected. And that's because by default, .NET APIs have CORS enabled, which stands for cross-origin resource sharing. It's basically a security precaution to prevent malicious services from constantly hitting your own API. But for demo purposes, we could just turn that off quick. So let's go into the program.cs file of our API. And inside of here, we can say builder.services.add CORS. So this will add the necessary services in order to use CORS. And then further down, we can just say app.use CORS. And in this case, we want to configure it to just allow any origin. And that way, it won't really check where the request is coming from. It'll just allow it. And for our simple UI setup here, that'll be fine. So with that set, and our component here is looking good as well, let's actually run this and test everything out. This should be working now. And remember, we need to run both projects for this to work. So first I'll right click on our API, and I'm just going to start this without debugging since we already know that works and we shouldn't have any problems there. So that'll launch. And then let's also start up our UI. And this one I will start with debugging. So we can launch those individually and then they'll be able to talk to each other now. Okay, so when our app loads in the browser, now let's test this out. So you can see we already have a new word. This was dynamically pulled in from our list. And we want to make sure that we select a language at the top here. So I'm going to choose German. And you could always default this to something besides English or whatever your default is so that you don't always have to pick this. But now when we hit translate, sure enough, there we get our translated word. Now in this case, the word is the same. But if we hit next and then we say translate again, you can see it's more obvious this time that it is translating the word. And our next functionality is also working correctly. So it loads in a new word and we can translate it. And of course, that is all working correctly. So if we switch this to Spanish and we hit next, this time we get the Spanish word instead of German. So you can see this is all working and it's all dynamic. And what's really great about this setup is that we could just add more languages here and pass those codes onto Azure and it's all dynamic. So our flashcard app could support 100 different languages with just a few simple changes. And as we page through these, we can see that the words, even though we have 1,000 words to choose from, we could also just add more words to that list. We could access a whole database. Having everything dynamic like this and using Azure really provides some nice functionality. You could even change this to use sentences or paragraphs. I really hope that you build on this app and just experiment with different things to see how this works because Azure Translate can do all kinds of things, especially in combination with Blazor. So it's kind of fun to just page through here and test these out. But go ahead and have fun with that. Okay, so there's one sort of bonus section left, and obviously this is optional, but I want to show you how you'd actually deploy this out to Azure. It's a little bit tricky because there are two projects here, and so we have to deploy them separately and then wire them up to talk to each other again out in the cloud, and they're going to have different URLs when they're out in Azure than they do locally. So this isn't too bad, but what we're going to do here is not really like an enterprise setup. There's going to be some manual work. You'd really want to automate all of this so that you don't have to worry about managing specific URLs and things like that. But let's just give this a go to see how this works at a high level. So let's right click on our API first. So let's start with this API and say publish. And we want to send this out to Azure. So choose Azure from this list. And in this case, we're going to go with Azure App Service. And we could just use Linux or Windows. I'm going to use Windows and click Next. And right now I have one app service running out there, but that's not the one I want to use. So I'm going to say create new, and I'll expand this a little bit so you can see some things here. So it'll give a default name based on the name of our project, and I'm just going to shorten that a little bit so it's more readable. And for our resource group, I'm just going to choose that flashcard app that we picked earlier, and I'm going to let it create a new hosting plan. The hosting plan is just what controls the resources that are available to the app. And then I'm going to say create. So this can take a minute, but this actually goes out and creates an app service in Azure. And then we'll be able to deploy to that after it's created. So I'll pause here for a second. All right, so that finished successfully. So let's select that and hit next. And we can skip this step. We don't care about API management right now, so I'll hit finish. And one of the most common mistakes for deploying through Visual Studio is people actually forget to hit this publish button. So this is what will actually go out and deploy that. So I'll click that and give this a go here. Okay, so once that completes, we can actually test that that is working by going to our /words endpoint, and sure enough, there all of our words pop in. Now, as a side note, there was actually an error the first time I deployed this and tried to hit this endpoint. One extra thing that you have to do is make sure to copy this words.txt as part of the publish. So if you go to the properties and you look at this copy to output, if you just say copy always, that'll make sure that this words.txt comes along for the ride with the publishing process. But now our API is out there. So again, on this words endpoint, this is all working. And it's the same process for our UI to get this working. But remember, we need to be able to access this URL from our UI. We have to update that when we deploy. Now, in a sophisticated deployment setup, this would automatically update your base URL for your UI when it deploys to prod, so it would point to your API. But for our simple setup, we're just going to go back into our program.cs file and paste in this new base URL. I know this is gross. Obviously, you'd want to set this up to be dynamic. But just to see things working out on the web, let's now publish. So that's the only change we have to make. Now we do have to create another app service. So I'm going to grab that again and say next. And I'm just going to create another new one. And this will again be the flashcards UI instead of the API. And I'm just going to choose our resource group again. And we could probably actually just use the same hosting plan since these are pretty low resource use. So I'm going to click create and give that a minute to finish. So that finished correctly. So let's select that and click finish. And now we can deploy this just like we did before. So I'll give that a second to finish again. All right, so once that finishes, it's out on the web and it's public, so anyone can access it, send it to your friends, and show them what you built. This is obviously designed for smaller screens as well, so it actually looks a little bit better with this format. You're probably going to want to play around with these font sizes and things. Right now, this is a little bit hacked to get this large enough for the demo for the recording here. But just play around with the styling and feel free to make adjustments and make this look how you want if you're comfortable with CSS and HTML. I just kind of created the bare minimum here to get this going. So again, thanks so much for watching. Please hit subscribe, and I'll see you next time right here at the Code Wolf.